Great. So part two, again, thank you all for joining us again today. So as Lynn just mentioned, she will be monitoring the chat, and if you have any questions, please do write them down, and we'll try and make sure we have time to address them at the end. So we went through a number of learning objectives last week, and moving on from there, this week we're going to talk about, first of all, how cognitive and communication problems that we discussed last week can affect all of the interactions within the justice system, and as well as the transition from the justice system back into the community. So we're going to spend quite a bit of time talking about that. We also want to talk a little bit about the difference between skill versus will. One of the questions that was raised last week, which we're going to address today, is the fact that individuals with brain injury are often misinterpreted in terms of the impetus behind their perceived behaviors. And this is really where the skill versus will comes into effect. The next thing we want to do is to make sure that you come away from this session with actual hands-on strategies that you can use in your own practice with your clients. And then, as always, we want to be able to share additional resources that you can use. So at this point, I'm actually going to turn it back over to Carol.
Well, thank you very much, Catherine and Lynn, for inviting me to take a little bit of time to review my role and set the context briefly for what ABI looks like in the North and what the resource capacity is here. And I have to say to the group listening, you're so very fortunate to be learning from these two amazing clinicians, scientists, advocates for brain injury. So I'm also feel very privileged to eavesdrop a little bit on your training today. So I just added a slide, Catherine, that I actually hadn't sent you because I was just thinking about today and youth with ABI, because I think that's the primary focus of your training here. And I wanted to mention that Northeastern Ontario, which is a large geographical area, has a higher incidence of traumatic brain injury than most other regions in Ontario. And this is long-standing. The data shows this over and over again. And even with that high incidence, we also have a long-standing pattern of zero specialized pediatric ABI services anywhere close. So often those patients get zero service, or they end up, if they make it to a trauma center in the Toronto region, for example, they may get some early rehab, but then usually not a lot of follow-up. So I thought that was important in the context of today's training, and then when I talk a little bit about my role and what other resources are available. So you can imagine that as a result of the first 2 points, there are many youth and adolescents in our region who fall through the cracks. And then they may find themselves in the justice system. And so you're picking them up, and they really haven't had much support or any. So I just wanted to state that briefly and put that in everybody's mind. So my role, it's a rather unique role. Years ago, our hospital, Health Sciences North here, in Sudbury had a coordinator type role, more of a system navigation. And I know last week you learned about the ABI system navigators. And so our hospital decided to switch our role to more of a advanced clinical practice guidance type role, focused more on the providers, whether those are health professionals or other people who are providing service to people with brain injury. So my focus, I interact a little bit less with people with brain injury themselves in this role. And I'm really focusing more on the people who are communicating with them in their role. I also do a lot of work around leading process and quality improvement initiatives around ABI best practice. So making sure that health professionals in particular are implementing the latest evidence and that the interventions and assessments they're using are aligned to the latest clinical guidelines and evidence. And that's where I look to people like Catherine and Lynn to see, you know, what's the latest and what should we be doing. My role, my main mandate is to work with hospital-based clinicians and programs that are hospital-based, and HSN is the hospital in the north that has those specialized dedicated ABI programs. And I would say I'm the primary contact for really anything that comes to our hospital brain injury related from external. So if a parole officer were to call our hospital and say, can somebody there help me understand brain injury, they would direct that to me. So I get all kinds of different calls you can imagine, even because we want to work externally, not just within our hospital walls, even though that's my main focus. Whether it's school boards or long-term care or some community agency, I try to respond to that request to the best of my ability. So despite, that's kind of what I was just saying, is despite my role being, you know, intended to focus on hospital, because there are so many gaps, not just in youth ABI, but adult brain injury services, my role has extended and expanded in all kinds of ways. So I know, and my colleagues know, there's nothing out there. So if we get a call and we have the knowledge and the ability to assist, whether that's to help facilitate a referral or to provide education and training or to consult about a specific case that's challenging, I will do that, and my colleagues will do that. I think that covers that. I mentioned that I know you were speaking, Julie Osbelt from the Toronto area was speaking about the navigator roles. I would say certainly in the north, my role is very complementary to the navigator role, and I work closely with the navigator. And so we kind of have a no wrong door policy. If she gets a call and she thinks I'm better equipped to deal with the requests, if it's something related more to training or education, or I didn't mention it, but I'll mention it at the end, I'm a speech language pathologist also by background. And so if it's something where it's a communication issue, I certainly will step up and take that on. Sometimes people are just wanting a little bit of written material, information, something they can read that they can share with somebody else to educate themselves or others about what the person they're working with who has the brain injury might be living and experiencing. So I share a lot of different materials depending on what the request is, or point people in the right direction where they can get additional training if I can't provide it myself within my scope. I mentioned that I am part of the program at Health Sciences North. We're the lead trauma hospital in the north. So a lot of the severe traumatic brain injury cases do come to our hospital first. And then we do have 10 inpatient ABI rehab beds at Health Sciences North. And we have our outpatient brain injury rehab service that also services clients regionally. And certainly they were doing a lot of tele-rehab pre-COVID, and they have really ramped that up. So if you're familiar with what used to be the Northeast Lynn area, where you go Sault Ste. Marie on one end and Parry Sound the other way, and way up north beyond Timmins. So we're servicing all those areas as well as we can. I do work with a lot of relevant partners. I wouldn't be able to do my job if I wasn't connected to a lot of wonderful experts and organizations who are doing a lot of great work in the area of brain injury. And some of them are the Ontario Neurotrauma Foundation, the Rehab Care Alliance, academic and research communities, Toronto ABI Network, Ontario Brain Injury Association. So I mention them because I need those network of people. I'm one person and I have my body of knowledge, but if I can't help you, I will reach into all of those networks to try to find somebody who can. I did want to mention, I don't know if it came up with the navigators or not, but The Ontario Brain Injury Association also has a lot of services that and peer services that can really sometimes help, I imagine, your clients and their families. They have set up a few unique positions here in the North specifically because, again, we have so many gaps. They're called the Northeastern Ontario Peer Advocates, I believe. And they have one based in the Nipissing area. And I know things might have slowed down with COVID, but they were supposed to hire another position in the Nipissing area and also in Sault Ste. Marie, which will be fabulous. And they'll take calls from everybody, and they work a lot in the community, primarily in the community. And I know they receive calls from the justice sector, often asking for help in dealing with those clients. So that's another resource in particular in the North. So if you were to call Obaya, and they would refer you to those NEO peer advocates, and I work closely with them also. So I'll sometimes get a call from them. So hopefully I'm illustrating that, you know, between all of us, if you are a probation or parole officer in the North and you're needing that extra support, we should be able to respond in some fashion and help you out. So for my role in particular, just to give you a little bit of guidance of when you would call me, if you have a client, of course, with a confirmed diagnosis of brain injury and you're looking for any resources, and it can be specific to communication and cognitive communication, but it doesn't have to be. Even though I'm a speech language pathologist by background, this is an all-encompassing role. So if it's outside of speech language pathology, I still have a ton of resources that I can send your way. If you're looking for some staff education and training, I am more focused on adults, and if it's very general, I would feel comfortable addressing some of the pediatric stuff, but I wouldn't put myself out there as a pediatric ABI expert, and so depending on the request. But if it's for generally understanding brain injury, I'm comfortable doing that. Let's see. That's it. I didn't want to take up too much time, so hopefully I gave you enough of a flavor that, you know, don't hesitate to call me. If I can't help you, I'll find somebody who can.
And thank you so very much. All right. So again, our learning objectives, recognizing how cognitive and communication problems can affect all of the interactions in the justice system and the transition from justice to the community. So you recall last week, we included in our package a communication style inventory. And what that was an opportunity for you to look at your own communication style and see if there were any areas that you felt might need some tweaking. So what I'd like to do now is to ask you, were there any aspects of your own communication style that may be challenging for others, especially clients with TBI-related communication disorders? So if you want to put anything in the chat, please feel free. And for those of you that did identify something, did you try and make any changes to your communication this past week? And if so, what was the experience? Was it easy to change? Were there any barriers to being able to try and change your communication style? Was there anything that supported? And did you notice any difference in terms of the impact of this on your communication partners? So I can't see the chat, so Lynn, I'm going to actually.
Yep, I will tell you what's in the chat.
Okay.
I will say one thing too. I did send out that reminder to you to complete it, and that was one of the strategies we'll talk about for helping people be successful when they have cognitive impairments, is something like advanced reminders instead of just waiting till someone doesn't do their homework. So Deb said she speaks too quickly and likely for too long. And Karen said she asked 2 questions at once. Oh my gosh. Lalia said that she has an English accent and is very sarcastic. I know that there was a study done looking at language test performance when the person had an accent, and scores were affected by that.
Interesting.
But it wasn't an English accent, so I'm not totally sure, but sarcasm absolutely fits with what we'll be talking about today. Melissa speaks quickly but tries to adjust. And the person whose last name is Kempy said uses short forms. We all do this, acronyms and short forms, and assume that clients know. Andrew said he speaks too fast and uses overly complex words and sentences, always trying to remind himself to slow down, especially when it's something that you might have reviewed many times, but the first time for the client. And I think that's so that I do believe people speak as fast as they can from a motor control point of view. So I think as a fast talker, it's a challenge to slow down. Karen said, Karen, you said you were trying to be more comfortable with silence, but it's really hard on the phone because you don't know if you're still connected. And that is an excellent point. So those are the
I think that's very, I think that's such a valuable comment, particularly now as so many of us are working online that we can't necessarily see the other person. And so that adds its own challenges and complexities.
And I think per the other points on Catherine's slide, when Andrew said he tries to remind himself to slow down, I am curious if anyone tried to change their behavior and how easy that was. Deb said she uses a lot of hand gestures, and probably now more when you're wearing a mask. I think the whole mask thing is really having such a profound effect. But yes, sometimes gestures, we talk about gestures that are distracting gestures versus gestures that are meant to like illustrate something. So I see your point, Deb.
Okay. Well, thank you all for sharing. Really, again, the point of that exercise is to bring some self-awareness. And so that's such an important first step in terms of modifying your communication and thinking about your impact on your clients. So you may recall this diagram from last week, and really it's meant to show the intersection of all of the different areas that are impacted following a brain injury, because again, they really do intersect and impact on each other. So what we'd like you to do now is to think about this in reference to your clients and the demands that are placed on them within the criminal justice system. So the next thing we're going to do is we're going to present a case study, and we did include this in the slides from last week, and we didn't have a chance to get to it, so you've probably read about it, but I think that this is really the best way to illustrate a lot of these principles. So we're going to talk about JH, and JH is a 17-year-old male who has recently been added to your caseload. So these are the charges. He's been charged with break and enter and theft of greater than $5,000. So during one of your preliminary meetings with JH, you learn the following. So he comes from a middle-class professional family. He'd been an excellent student in middle school and his early high school years. JH was a high-level rep hockey player from grades 7 to 11. He was a forward on a AAA team, and for those of you who are not familiar with hockey, AAA is the highest level that you can play up into the high school level. So JH is actually smaller than most hockey players, and he said that his problems seemed to begin with hockey. In his own words, he described the following. Because I was always smaller than the other players, especially the defense, so he was a forward, when the players would check me, their shoulder pads would hit my head, and then my head would get slammed into the boards. So again, for those of you who may not be familiar with hockey, the checking process is such that so you can see me. So if I'm coming in and I'm going to check another player, usually what I would do would be to lean in with my shoulder, and my water glass will be the other player, and I would check the other player into the boards. But what happened, because of the height discrepancy, the shoulder hit JH in the head. So over and over, his head would be slammed into the boards. And he described that this used to happen approximately 10 to 15 times a game. And it was just worse during tournaments and playoffs when the intensity tends to pick up. He commented again, I would see stars and feel nauseous and dizzy, but no one really noticed and I'd keep on playing. By grade 10, I was still playing, but had headaches all the time. I couldn't concentrate in class. The lights and the noise in the classroom were too much, so he was light sensitive and noise sensitive. I wasn't doing my homework. I felt depressed, and I started drinking and smoking weed to feel better. I didn't understand what was happening to me. I couldn't think clearly. I couldn't read what was on the page or on my computer screen. I couldn't explain things the way I used to. Half the time I had no idea what the teacher was saying, and I couldn't remember from class to class. My ears were ringing a lot. My parents, my teachers, and coaches thought I was unmotivated and didn't care. And by that point, I didn't care. I got dropped from my hockey team and I got busted for drinking underage. Midway through grade 11, when I was 16, I dropped out of school. I felt depressed and angry at everyone. Then we learned a little bit about JH's family, and he reported, my parents are pretty conservative. They have high expectations. You recall he was an excellent student in middle school and early high school. So my parents told me that if I'm not in school, I need to leave. I'm out of the house. So I've been couch surfing. I don't have any money. I don't talk to my parents anymore. My dad's a real law and order type, and he'd be so pissed and disappointed to know I'm a criminal. WTF. So those were his words. So what we're going to do now is we're going to assign you into some breakout discussion groups. For those of you who are not familiar with Zoom, you're going to suddenly remotely be put into a group. We haven't lost you, we haven't dropped you. And we'd like you to spend the next 15 minutes with your group talking about the following. So number one, what was missed? What are the signs that people should have been detecting in terms of JH? What was he clearly showing that was an issue? And who is responsible? Who should have been detecting these signs? So that's number one. Number two, what are the communication barriers and challenges for JH in navigating the youth justice system? How is this going to impact him in the youth justice system? For you as probation and parole officers, he is 17, so he's a youth. What do you need to consider in terms of establishing risk, need, and responsivity? And finally, what other information do you need to determine how to communicate with and potentially support him as he goes through the system? All right, so we're going to give you 15 minutes. All right. Is everyone's back? So that's great. Thank you. I was very happy to be involved in group number one, and we had some great discussions. So I hope that the other groups likewise did. So I'm hoping that each group nominated a spokesperson. I hope you're comfortable. I hope that's okay. Again, this is very much a brainstorming exercise. There's no right or wrong answers. It's just an opportunity for you to consider some things. So why don't I go to group number 4 to start, and we'll work our way up to group number 1. And I'm just going to give you literally about 2 minutes per group just to summarize the points that you came up with. So group number 4, do we have a spokesperson? How about group number 3? Everybody's shy.
I'll be the spokesperson for group 3.
Thank you so much.
It's Faith. Sorry, it's Faith Bromby.
Hi, thank you so much. Okay.
So we didn't realize there was a point form, so we basically.
Oh no, it's okay. Yeah.
So we basically
this is very relaxed. It's all
yeah.
Good.
We basically just talked about how for this individual, there's several people who could have been asking questions along the way or noticing the extent of potential injury or the risk for ABI, from the coaches to parents asking if they're viewing the sports and the hits and watching the games, to teachers starting to question why there was a difference and not just associating it with some other factors like the alcohol use or, you know, losing peer group or recreational activities, all those things that we see on a risk needs assessment. Um, we also talked about the youth being to kind of advocating for himself and expressing concerns earlier, that he also had a bit of a responsibility to that. As far as within the courts, some concerns that we expressed for the youth was the fact that just depending even on his memory, the ability for him to be reminded of court appointments or probation appointments if he was placed on probation, and does he understand even how to get to the court? Does he know where it is? Does he have short-term memory loss? Those things that could result in him getting further charges for failing to appear or not coming on time, or uh, does he understand if he was released on terms? Like, does he understand the conditions of his release? Um, we were saying that I know in my former courthouse that we do have ABI individuals there, um, but just how we can support with reminders and connecting him to maybe even mental health supports and that at the court. Um, I think that's kind of the biggest thing, and something that we didn't talk in concern is that with even COVID right now, um, the big thing is a lot of our clients don't even really get to speak. Their lawyer speaks for them. Lawyers are in a hurry. They're very quick. They don't get information. So my concern would be this information even coming out at a court level, because a youth doesn't even sometimes get to say anything aside from, do you understand the charges before you? And they say yes and confirm the spelling of their name and their birth date. And that's about it through whole proceedings, or at least initial. So I think it's just about having people there to advocate, or even at the onset of court proceedings would be great. There's assistants in the room who are asking questions.
Thank you, Faith. Those are excellent points, and also speaks to the issue of needing to train lawyers and judges, which is on our radar as well. So thank you. That's excellent. Group number 2. Did you, again, there's no pressure. Is there anything that you would like to add? Okay. Group, oh, yes?
It's Roseanne Roy. I was in group number 4, and we didn't assign anyone to be the speaker, but, and I didn't know if anybody else would pipe up who was in my group because I was late to join. So our conversation was very similar to everything that Faith Bromby had just indicated in terms of the risk signs and overlooking the symptomatology of the potential brain injury. When he had the ringing in the ears and all the headaches and everything was attributed probably to behaviors with alcohol and drugs and missing the boat. We did talk a little bit about missing those things during our intake screening as well in youth justice, and it not being evident during the RNA. In terms of those things coming up and potentially not looking at the factors that, he was in hockey and sports a lot when he was younger and had a lot of potentially concussions that would have resulted in ABI. And those questions aren't necessarily going to come up during our screening process.
Right.
So that's where there's definitely a need for improvement during our intake screening and our RNA.
Right.
So Roseanne,
right.
I mentioned in our group that the main mission of this research project Catherine and I are working on is figuring out where screening can take place. So we welcome your thoughts about that, either in the chat or speak up now, or you can email us after, because we recognize it's not the same everywhere. So we would love to know more about your thoughts on that.
So there are some court screening projects that were piloted in different areas, and I think that's one of the places to start. And I do believe that the ministry was looking at, there needs to be some tweaks, obviously, to the RNA as we gain more information about extenuating circumstances physiologically and other things that can be going on. So yeah, I'll probably send a note, but yeah.
Okay. Thank you. That's really helpful. And I'm so pleased you raised this from a number of reasons, but also because it's reminding me that we let you know that we were going to actually send out the HELP screening tool, which I did not do this morning, but that is the one that's up, and I'm going to do that after we finish. I'm making a note to myself. So that is one that is used widely by all the LIN navigators across Ontario. And I see there was another, oh, interesting, from Andrew. I think Adult Therapeutic Court in London will screen for ABIs as part of their assessment process. So one of the things we're trying to do, and I don't want to deviate too much because again, I'm cognizant of time, but we are trying to implement a similar process to the Niagara Youth Court Screening Initiative, which is the mental health youth court screening. So we are trying to implement a similar process for ABI screening. All right, group number 1. And Deb, you were our spokesperson. Yeah.
So we talked about the signs that seem to have been missed, and including headaches, feeling sick, slipping grades, substance use, losing comprehension, the other physical symptoms like the ringing of the ears, and then attitude changes, which would be maybe a little bit more obvious to the outside, like he might not have to actually talk about that. Withdrawing, another thing that he wouldn't necessarily have to talk about, people could see that as a sign. Dropping out of school, mood changes, motivation changes. And then as for navigating the court system, physically navigating court, like understanding where everything is and understanding instructions of how to get to places, following along with the conversation, because as was said, court moves quickly. Maintaining concentration and focus in court, and even the lighting and the sort of environmental factors. Then we talked about R&R, advocating or having someone advocate for him to get back to school. Risk is linked to managing his TBI regarding compliance and substance use, using the navigators that were spoken about already, and then substance abuse and how it's linked to each of the components of R&R. And those were all the notes I took.
Okay, all right, that's great, thank you. Okay, so those are all extremely important points, and thank you, because that's exactly what we were aiming for you to consider and discuss. And thank you for also raising important points that are helpful for us to learn too in our own work. Okay, so I'm actually going to suggest that we take, because we didn't give you a break last time, so I apologize. We're going to give you now a 5-minute break before we switch over, and then Lynn is going to talk with you more in depth about the cognitive and communication issues.
Okay, I think we're going to get started with the remainder of our presentation. Do know that this is short. Hopefully this will just whet your appetite for learning more about brain injury. And Catherine and I are always happy to talk about it. So we're just so, as we said last time, so grateful for the opportunity to talk to all of you and for your time today. So last week, we introduced the idea of a cognitive communication disorder. For those of you who weren't with us last Thursday, this is defined as a communication problem that comes from underlying cognitive impairments. And we coined that term because it's different than another common communication problem, which is aphasia, that some of you might know, that comes from a focal language problem. So we talked about the types of cognitive functions impaired in TBI, and these are common communication challenges that result from that. So having trouble processing information, especially in a conversation or in an interaction, as opposed to just sitting down and having time to look at something in writing. And those problems will vary as a function of how fast the information is coming, how much it is, and how complex it is. So if you're a person who tends to speak in complex sentences with a lot of embedded clauses and abstract terms, you probably are more difficult for a person with brain injury to understand than someone who says the same number of words, but says them more slowly and in a simpler grammatical structure. A lot of people with brain injury have trouble using and understanding language in many different types of situations and contexts, trouble expressing ideas and feelings, and then generally having challenges being in the moment and staying focused on the communication interaction, especially with a distracting environment. So we're going to talk a little bit more about those. And as we talk, we hope you'll be thinking of your interactions with your clients, but also be thinking of other places in the youth justice system or the adult justice system where people are going to have challenges, like in the courtroom. Catherine and I wanted to share this paper with you. Joe Wazalik was a PhD student with me in Wisconsin. He has a dual degree in neuroscience and the law, so he's a practicing lawyer. And he published this paper that has many, many examples of challenges for young people in criminal justice. So Catherine and I are going to look into making it available to you. We weren't sure about copyright, so we didn't send you out a copy, but we'll hope to make that available to you. So I just wanted to walk through some of the challenges and how they look. So when a young person or an adult has a cognitive communication disorder, often the way it looks is that they miss things. So they miss abstract language, especially things like sarcasm that have non-literal meanings where you're supposed to look behind the words. And we'll give you some examples of those in a moment. But also, if you think just of the burden of new vocabulary learning to navigate the justice system. So terms like pretrial detention or custodial sentence, extrajudicial measures, which I have to say, Catherine and I were 2 months into this project before I sorted out that EJMs and EJSs were not the same thing and could figure out the difference between those two. Even words like proceedings, which we use a lot, and are entitled, like entitled that you're rights that you're entitled to. That's all new vocabulary. So a young person, sorry, we're so focused on young people. I have to keep saying a person with brain injury would have to learn all that, remember it, and actually fully understand it. So not just superficially understand it, but fully understand what something like entitled means. People might have also difficulty, as I alluded to earlier, with long multi-clause sentences. I am a terrible offender for this. So I tend to have sentences that have a lot of side clauses. I have a wonderful sample from a young woman who was shot, and she said, the guy who shot me, he was like this guy, like I don't even know why he was at my house. Like he doesn't even know, like my boyfriend said he didn't like him, but he doesn't really like him, and he's the one who shot me. And so that doesn't sound very complex, but that sentence has a whole bunch of embedded clauses. And to follow the he's and she's and the order things are happening is really complicated. So a person with a brain injury might just only get the highlights of that sentence and maybe not even get the main message. Also, speech and noise. So speech in any kind of degraded information is a challenge. So in noise is one, if the lighting in the room is not very good and they can't see your face, if you have a mask, as we're all learning, that really distracts from it. I know Debbie said she uses her hands. That degrades the signal because it's competing. So any situation where you're competing for focusing on communication is a problem. I don't know about you, but I have a tendency to multitask sometimes when I'm talking, and people with brain injury have called me out on that and said, could you just do one thing at once because I need your attention. So if you're writing like this and you're talking to me, I'm distracted by your writing. So I need you to just be talking straight to me. In general, written information is better because it's permanent. So if you say something, it's ephemeral. You say it and the auditory signal is gone, but you get it in a note and you can go back and look at it later. So Catherine pulled these really fantastic quotes from the police warning. So if you look at this, can anyone say what of this might be a challenge for a person with a brain injury and cognitive impairments? Yes, exactly, Andrew, all of it. And you know what? You don't even have to have a brain injury because frankly, if you're not familiar with this kind of language, this is really complicated. Yeah, need not, right. Oh, that's really funny. So Karen said, sure, you say that I don't have to say anything. And you use the word need not, which why did you even say that? And then right after that, you asked me a question. And so you told me I didn't have to say anything. And then you asked me to say something. So yes, very confusing. Here's another one that Catherine pulled. Oops, sorry. I've got the, oh, I can't.
My apologies. Yeah, just every time I have shown this in training, and I've even done training with Toronto Police Services and their mental health and crisis intervention team. And, you know, we almost laugh because it's just such old British formal legal terminology that is so not relevant to our society today. And it's so complex. And you'll notice that each warning is followed with, do you understand? And of course, 99.9% of the time the people say, yes, thank you, Deb. You clearly understand, says who. And of course, most people say, yes, of course I understand.
Right. And so, and Catherine's going to talk about that a little bit later,
Mm-hmm.
an alternative to asking that question using what we talked about in my group, a teach back, where you say, sometimes I say things that are too full of jargon. So can you just tell me what you got out of that to make sure I was clear so that it's on you? But yes. Yes, so thank you, Andrea, for saying that about FASD. So there's a lot of overlap in cognitive challenges between people on the FA spectrum and people who have TBI. The basic things about processing speed, new problems learning new information, right? So you have to really do more than just do you understand. I was saying to Catherine that in the US, there's a large body of scholarship on how people don't understand the Miranda warnings. So it's not surprising. So, and this is the arrest that Catherine pulled. And I should talk to you at the same time as you're reading, because that's an example of a distracting condition. That's the other thing that happens, that people are asked to do something, but then there's conversations going on around them, so they can't really pay attention. And I want to just refer back to Andrew's comment about needing a nap, because that follows what we were talking last time about self-regulation fatigue. So if you have to put this much mental effort into understanding basic language, then probably you're not going to have a lot of mental energy for controlling your own behavior. So that's on the comprehension side. People with cognitive communication disorders also can have impairments on the production or the expression side. Yes, that's true, Faith. Even how they word offenses, I find very difficult to understand. So I'm sure people with brain injury do as well. So on the production side, a common thing that we hear from people with brain injury, and that's been shown many times in research, is that many people have trouble just telling a story. And in fact, telling a story is the place where some impairments show up, even more than on a test. And that includes maybe not saying things in sequential order, or using he's and she's and other pronouns instead of the main words because of not being able to come up with proper nouns. So those things stories can be incomplete, and it's especially hard under pressure. So under time pressure or other kinds of pressure, which is the justice system. So people need to get through the system quickly. I know Matthew Eaton Kent, the lawyer who's on our project, was saying sometimes it's a hallway conversation with a lawyer. It's quick. They want to, get things done. And like someone mentioned early, the person might not even have a chance to talk. So it might be really quick. And those are the worst conditions for someone. High stress, time pressure, and a big demand for being accurate, sequential, and concise. That's sort of the most difficult situation. Also, people with brain injury may have trouble. We talked about shifting last time in executive function. So speaking in a way that that doesn't fit the style. So not being as respectful as you need to be to the judge because you're using the same tone you used with a friend. So being able to be flexible about how you talk to whom. And I see Faith put that the way people interpret this behavior is, as we have in a little bit, is biased. So it's interpreted as intentional, a bad attitude, something like that. So I put this sentence on these slides just for you to think about when in your workspace you think this would be needed. And again, in the interest of time, we don't have to discuss each of those, but for all of these, I think it's good to think, like, in my office, in my interactions with my client, in the online world, when does that person have to tell a story? And do it in a coherent way. And it's high stakes, right? So in this setting, it's a high stakes story. Social communication is that's what I study, and Catherine has studied in the past. Catherine's also a sleep expert. If you don't know that already about her, is an expert in sleep and brain injury and how that affects your thinking. So social communication is the area, it's the least structured aspect of our life. So in school or work, often you have a task that has parameters and you know what you're supposed to do and there's a procedure. But out in this social world and social interactions, there aren't a lot of written rules. And so that's where a lot of people with cognitive communication disorders kind of fall apart. So when it's unstructured, that's when you may see more behavior that gets judged as being disrespectful or other sort of negative terms. One aspect of social communication, and this is the main thing we study in my lab, is that a lot of people with brain injury, about a third, seem to have trouble trying to read other people. So I can't really tell if I'm annoying you right now, or I think I'm not annoying you, but I really am annoying you. And so that leads to a lot of behaviors that are judged as, not really appropriate for the situation. And these sort of social rules that aren't stated are sometimes called the hidden curriculum. So how are you supposed to behave in this situation? Like, you think people watch TV, they know how to behave in court? That's kind of the hidden curriculum. And I first heard that term from a mom of a young man with autism. And she was saying that for people with autism, the world is a hidden curriculum. So all the social rules that aren't written down are things that some people with autism, they don't just pick up. They don't just automatically pick up. And a lot of people with brain injury are at sort of a double disadvantage because they had that and then they lost it. So depending when the injury was, they may not realize that they're not the same person and they're not as good at detecting that as they used to. Oh, your dad had a stroke and lost it. Yes. So it can be lost with acquired brain injury. And I'm sorry to hear that. This, I think, is very, very hard on families. So added to this, poor literacy is very, yes, I'm sorry, let me just respond to Debbie's comment. So yes, both things happen. So trouble reading other people and understanding their cues, and then trouble controlling and flexibly changing your behavior to meet the social needs of the environment. So both of those things can happen, not always in the same person, but often in the same person. So some people are a little bit better at one than the other, but that's not always true. So you can't always assume that someone, because they're good at talking, you can't always assume they can read you. That's really something that can be separately impaired. So poor literacy, as you all know better than we do, is endemic in the justice system with adults and children. Pam Snow does a lot of this research in Australia, has called poor literacy and language problems a pipeline into youth justice. People are not going to say that they aren't literate, as again, you know really well, because this is something that's really, it's really stigmatizing in our culture not to be able to understand language. So if you think of that on top of the memory problems and the executive function problems, you can see why it's even more challenging for many people in the justice system to follow along with what's going on. And these problems can affect every single interaction that the person has in the justice system. We are focused on young people because they're still learning about all of these things, and they have many transitions. So transitions from school to work and transitions from the justice system into the community. And so when they have to follow directions, they have to understand what you say, what other people say, what you really meant that wasn't what you said, convey respect, convey accountability. And as one police officer told a group of us in the spring, remorse that is the most important thing that a young offender at least has to demonstrate. They have to show remorse. If you can't understand that you're supposed to do that, and you don't, because that's really reading between the lines. I think initially people often don't say, I need you to demonstrate remorse by saying this, this, and this. You kind of are supposed to figure that out by yourself. That all of those things can be special challenges for people that have brain injury, as they are for people who have FASD and other kinds of cognitive impairments that lead to cognitive communication problems. And so, Kath, I'm going to switch back to Catherine to talk about strategies, but I do hope you think along the lines of your communication style inventory of one change that you can make right away in your workplace to help support people with these cognitive communication challenges.
Okay, so again, one of our primary aims is to give you some tools and strategies that you can use with your clients. So before we move on to that, I want to think a little bit, I don't remember who it was that raised this last week, but it was a very valuable point, is that these challenges are often misinterpreted. The cognitive communication and the social communication challenges are often misunderstood, and these misperceptions are very rarely positive. It's very rare that someone says about a person with a brain injury, oh, he's a really good communicator, or his behavior is exceptional. So Lynn talked a little bit about the need to show remorse or to show deference and respect. And the opposite of that, so again, looking at the vocabulary, is disobedience, disregard, noncompliance, rudeness, defiance. And of course, those are the misinterpretations that are laid upon people with brain injuries. If they have difficulty remembering, or they have poor social communication, it's interpreted that the person is being rude. So they are interpreted as being rude, defiant. We talked before about, being inattentive in the courtroom. They're looking out the window. Our case study, JH, was perceived as having a bad attitude, that they're being careless, that they're not sensitive to others or lack consideration. And then we also see a lot of negative behaviors, from passivity. Some people following a brain injury may actually present as being very flat and apathetic. And on the other hand, we can see people that become hyperverbal, very labile in their emotional presentation, and they can be aggressive and very impulsive. So these are the things that we misinterpret. So again, on the left, these are the things that we've seen, and I'm sorry, let me just actually play from current slides so there's a full screen there. But what's really going on, this is why we've been asking you to do all of these exercises, that we want you to look behind the scenes and think about what is actually happening. So they're having difficulty following and comprehending the conversation and the body language and the subtle cues. Many times, of course, they're feeling scared, they're feeling threatened. I mean, the criminal justice system is a high stress, high stakes environment. So on top of that, we see anxiety, we see the issue of the memory. And the other thing here, this term HALT, this was actually shared with me by a group of probation officers where I did some previous training. And they talk about this combination, particularly in the adult world, for individuals who may be unstably housed, and certainly JH is a good example of that, is that they're lonely. Social isolation is such a significant negative outcome of brain injury. Angry, they're hungry, and they're tired. And because I do have expertise in sleep, we all know, I mean, we don't need to have expertise, that lack of sleep makes all of us even more irritable, and we see a lot of sleep issues following brain injury. Okay, so we're going to talk a little bit about the difference between skill versus will, and I'm getting the sense that you probably have an understanding of what this is already. So we often think when somebody is having difficulty that if they just try harder, that they should be fine. And I raised the comment last week about hearing about the judge in the US who made the comment that, well, he had had a concussion and he was just fine, so what was the big deal all about? I've had insurance adjusters, pardon me, ask me, well, shouldn't this person's brain injury be cured by now? Like, what is the problem? You know, we think they're just not trying hard enough. But we know that with the exception of you know, mild first concussions in the majority of people, that people do fully recover. We know that brain injury is a chronic disease and a lifelong condition. So we know that this is not possible without support. We talk about environmental modifications, strategies, and rehabilitation. And I made the comment last week that for the majority of us over 40, are all wearing our reader glasses. And, you know, that's like saying to somebody, well, just take off your glasses and squint harder. And we know that that's not the case. So that's an example of skill versus will. So what was judged as reflecting will, but really could have been skill? So we know in his case, you know, he seemed to be unmotivated. He seemed to not care. He was having difficulty in school, but what we really know is that he was having difficulty processing, comprehending, following the teacher. We know that for certainly following concussion and sometimes moderate severe injury, that people actually have difficulty with reading and scanning and looking at text. He had ringing in his ears. He had headaches, sensitivity. So it was interpreted that he was willfully not caring and not trying, but really he was lacking the skill to follow and comprehend and participate in school. All right, so what can we do? What can you do to support these individuals? So we've talked a lot about lighting. So first of all, if it's possible, take the individual to a quiet room with limited distractions. So we know that's not always possible within the criminal justice system, but certainly within your own work, wherever you can. If they're bothered by lights, ask them, turn the lights down. Fluorescent lights are particularly a challenge for individuals following brain injury, and particularly following concussion. Again, we talked about the issue of speaking a bit more slowly. And I just caught myself. I realized I just looked at my clock and I saw it's 2:51 and I'm conscious of time. So I realized that I was actually speeding up my speech, but I don't need to do that. I'd rather you learn. So I'm going to slow down, speak calmly, and try to use shorter sentences. So those are 3 things that you can do. Try to slow down, try to speak calmly, and try to use the shorter sentences, thinking back to the multiple clauses, as well as the exercise that you did at the beginning last week, where we asked you to speak without using the words and the. Pause in between. So give the individual time to process. I thank Lynn for reminding me that we really did need to take a break for 5 minutes, because I'd rather you take a break and assimilate and process what we've learned rather than trying to rush through. We talked a lot about the expressive side or language production. So we're going to expect that their story and our responses may be unclear or jumbled. And this does not mean that the individual is intoxicated. It doesn't mean that they're not. They may well be, and JH certainly had issues with alcohol. But it's astonishing how often that is the assumption, that the person is drunk, that the person is stoned, that they're high, that they're using drugs. Certainly, we talked about the issue of asking, you know, please tell me back what you understand, rather than saying, do you understand, where we know the individual is going to say yes, but that doesn't necessarily mean anything. One of the most important things is letting them know, particularly in establishing your relationship as probation and parole officers, that this is a safe space, that it's okay, that they can ask for repetition or clarification at any time. And in fact, you may want to do this each time you maybe shift the topic. Just say, how are you doing? Is this making sense? Is there anything that you'd like me to re-explain? The next point is very important, because we do know that sadly individuals do get injured while they are within the criminal justice system, or they may be brought to you following an assault, etc. So if for any reason that you suspect that the person has just sustained a brain injury, even if you think it's mild, please do take them to the emergency room for medical attention before you question them. For their health, and also because the statement that you get from them is not likely going to be accurate, and thus is not going to be admissible. So some additional strategies, Lynn mentioned earlier that writing is really helpful. So if you could provide, each time you change the topic, provide a brief summary of the main points after each section of the conversation. As I mentioned earlier, ask them, you know, is there anything that you'd like me to explain again or say in different words? Don't ask them if they understand. I think you've all got that after reading the police warnings. Where possible, use visual aids like pictures, maps, or draw out a timeline. There's a couple of really useful visual schematic maps actually of the criminal justice system. And those can be really helpful to walk your client through in terms of what's going to be happening next. So wherever you can, use a picture or draw it out in sequence. The other thing that's very important, and again, this was a point that was raised last time, and it might have been Karen, and I apologize if I have that wrong. How do we support someone when they're in crisis? So this is really important because when someone is in crisis, they are in fight or flight mode and they're not processing. They're just literally acting on instinct. Their parasympathetic nervous system is shut down and their sympathetic fight or flight mode has switched on. So you need to reassure them that things are safe and use a trauma-informed way of communicating. Speak slowly. We have a colleague who has lived experience, and he's actually developed something called an eye care kit. And I will send you out some information about this because this is a series of small tactile materials that can be used, like a squishy toy or something soft that they can touch. Small ice packs that can be used to cool, etc. And they've been found to be really useful. As I say, it's called an eye care kit. So if someone is in crisis, again, just very small amount of verbal information, calm, low lights, give them time, reassure them that it's a safe place. The note taking is really helpful. Again, as Lynn talked about, the writing is a permanent record. So during each session, write down a few notes and ask the client, would this be helpful for you to take this away with you? So that we're all very aware of the memory challenges. So if you need to see the person again, try to set up realistic reminder strategies. Even if that means you have to give them a call, you have to text them. Don't assume the person is going to remember your conversation or the appointment. And we know that this is one of the main causes of breaching conditions of bail, is because individuals literally forget or they really didn't understand the conditions. We also wanted to raise the issue of risk factors, and we've talked about the majority of them. So hearing loss and tinnitus, so the ringing in the ear. We haven't really mentioned the issue of hearing before, but this is also important. We know that hearing loss is quite common following brain injury. So if you have any doubts, I mean, first of all, ask. And if you have any doubts, I mean, refer the individual for a hearing test. Poor sleep. So this is disturbed, unrestful sleep is very common in individuals following TBI. Poor nutrition, lack of social support, all of these things you know. And again, I'm cognizant of time, so I'm just going to move through them. Returning to JH, what did we miss? Slow processing, difficulty reading, difficulty organizing and expressing thoughts, ideas, understanding, and likely some poor reasoning and decision making that might have influenced the drinking, smoking weed, and that he would need some support for to prevent recidivism. So we talked about some of the communication barriers, and you've all come up with some really great ideas. And we've given you some strategies. So again, I'm not going to spend a lot of time on this, recognizing that we're almost out of time. What's really important too is how are these challenges going to affect your clients in other aspects of the criminal justice system? Ask them what would help them. Sometimes they do know. They might not always know, but always ask. Faith, you brought up the great, I think it was Faith that brought up the great point about the additional funds. So yes, request an assessment by a speech language pathologist. Think about, you know, who do you as POs also need to educate about your client's communication problem? Maybe you could share this with a lawyer, with the Crown, the mental health youth court worker, etc. We talked a little bit about the skill versus will. I'm going to go through this. You have access to the slides. I do want to also point out that in the resources, I've included the link to a program called Substance Use and Brain Injury. There's a manual in there, so that's really helpful. And then finally, the specialized services and reintegration support. So we would strongly recommend that if it seems appropriate, that you may want to consider accessing a speech language pathologist to support your client. This is the link to our professional association, to their private practice website, an occupational therapist to help with planning, pacing, vocational planning, etc. In the UK, the youth offending teams have a speech language pathologist on every youth offending team that screens every youth that comes in to the team. And they are screened, but they're also offered the benefits of therapy, and the majority of them do take up the offer, and there's been some really positive benefits. The next is communication intermediaries. If you really perceive that your client is having significant difficulty, this is an organization, Communication Disabilities Access Canada, who can provide a communication intermediary to support your client in court, and I've given you the website for that. And then we've also given you these additional resources. So it is exactly 3:01. We managed to, oh, how feasible is it to access a neuropsychological assessment? That's a great comment. I think most often neuropsychological assessment is not publicly funded. However, through CAMH, Ontario Shores is another excellent psychiatric hospital in Whitby that has a traumatic brain injury program. And then I would reach out to your LIN navigators to ask about neuropsychological assessment. And I think, unfortunately, we're out of time. But I just wanted to extend my thanks to Lynn Turkstra for doing this together with me, to our guests last week, Julie Osbelt, to Carol DeSalle. A huge thank you to Deb Causey for organizing, for Karen Tinning, Chris Podolinsky for your leadership and support over the last few years. We look forward to continuing to work with you. And lastly, a huge thank you to our funder, the Ontario Neurotrauma Foundation, for supporting this webinar. We are hopeful that it will be available to you, the actual recordings as well. So please do feel free to reach out to us if you have further questions. I will send you out the help screening tool, and we'll say goodbye for today.